Um, hey everyone, I'm Ellen Weiss, President of the Board of FIJ, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is focusing on helping you get some of our money by crafting a winning submission for one of our grants. Um, as many of you know, the mission of FIJ is to support independent and nonprofit journalists to produce high quality, unbiased investigative stories with impact. Again, we want to give you money to do this work. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We have lots of information and slides to share with you. We have two fantastic guests. I'm going to go through some initial slides, then I'll be prompting Amy and Robert with some questions, but you should feel free to chime in with your own questions. You can put them in the Q&A part of the webinar. The more interactive, the better. Also, we are recording this webinar and we'll be posting it onto the FIJ website. Anyone who registered is also going to get a link with the recording. So the bottom line is you don't have to take notes if you don't want to. You are safe. And finally, just one last thing, which is we are really focusing on what makes a great proposal for an FIJ grant. In general, I would say that what makes a great proposal for anybody is one that really addresses that organization's criteria, right? So what works for FIJ might not exactly work for someone else, but as you consider other grants, and we encourage you to seek other grants, just pay close attention to what they're looking for. It'll be really, really helpful. Right now, I am going to share my screen as we go through. Let me just turn this in slideshow. Let me get back onto sharing my screen. Just going to go through some 101s in terms of FIJ grants. So let me do this. Too much stuff on my thing. All right. So first of all, what kind of funding does FIJ provide? We have several different kinds of grants, right? There's a regular grant, which is up to $10,000. And this is really to help, for some people, get that story across the finish line. You've done a lot of preliminary work. You know there's a story, right? And so this is that stage of the reporting. We have seed grants, right, which is up to $25,000. And this is for the preliminary reporting, the stuff that can help
2,500, Ellen.
2,500,
2,500.
sorry,
I
that can
wish.
help shape your investigative stories. That's a wish, not a promise, right? Um, often as our guest today, journalists who get seed grants come back and apply for regular grants after the preliminary reporting is finished. And nothing makes us happier than to continue funding great reporting from the seed stage to the regular stage to the next stage, which is a follow-up grant, right? You've done reporting, you're onto a story, you got a regular grant. Now you want to do more follow-up stories after the initial investigation runs. And so we have follow-up grants as well. I will say that we also now offer an Alicia Patterson Fellowship. These are larger grants. They're up to $40,000 and they're for multi-part investigations. We're going to have another webinar about the submission for those grants closer to the application deadline. So just want to let you know that we have even more money to give away, which is really wonderful. So what's a seed grant, right? A seed grant, again, for $2,500 for that preliminary reporting, the reporting that can help you kind of shape and focus something that can lead to a bigger story, right? As we'll discuss with all our grants, they need to be investigative. These are investigative stories, not explanatory stories, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And also US focused, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that under eligibility. What does it cover? They cover open records, initial reporting trips. They can also be a stipend for you to help cover your reporting time. We're going to look at an application in a minute, but an overview, we want to know like what your initial reporting has found, what your reporting plan is, why you're well suited to do the story, right? And also, most of the stories that we are all working on, the topic's been covered, right? Maybe even the specific story idea that you have. So what we want to know is how you're going to advance that story. It's okay that that story's been covered. We want to actually know that you've done your due diligence and how your story is different, right? For a seed grant, right, you don't need a commitment letter or initial findings, meaning like part of what you're trying to do is generate initial findings. You just need a strong reason, something more than a hunch to believe that there's a story there, right? Again, for the regular application, again, we're going to ask the same question. What is it that you're going to be uncovering? What's investigative about it? Here we want more detailed findings that you have, right? We need a more specific plan, right? A roadmap for how you're going to track down, how you're going to verify the information that you've gathered. Again, what makes it new and why you? Like maybe you have special skills, maybe you have a specific expertise. This is just kind of what our grant application looks like, right? We try to have, give you some guardrails for how much to write in certain areas, right? So, but just so you have a sense, and all of this is on our website. We get a lot of questions about who's eligible, right? Most of our grants are for freelancers, right? But all journalists are eligible. Sometimes you're working inside an organization and you have a really great idea. The organization may not want to support it. It's something you want to do on your own time. That's okay. Sometimes we support for-profit organizations. Mostly we try to support nonprofit and freelance reporters, right? Um, Limitations to formats, not really. We will support text-based, digital, audio, video, documentary, photojournalism, even books, right? A lot of questions about international stories. So international stories can be eligible, right? But they either need to come from a US-based reporter or have a strong US angle, and I should say have a strong US angle, right? Something that involves a business in America, how a government policy might be affecting somebody or someplace overseas. You also want the stories to have a U.S. outlet where they're going to be published. So international's okay with a couple of extra filters. In terms of budget, right? And we'll show you, or, excuse me, online, you can actually see a budget template that we try to give you, right? So there are the hard costs, there's travel, there's records fees, there's data collection, and again, there's reporting time. What we don't cover are things like buying equipment, renting office space. So there's a lot that we can put into a budget that you should be thinking about and not hesitate, again, to pay for your time, right? But you can download this budget template. It's linked on the application form. There's a sample budget there to help you. And just a reminder of our upcoming deadlines, right? Monday, April 27th is the deadline for both the regular grants and seed grants. In addition to this webinar, there's more information. And if you need any additional information or help, you can email us. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Yeah. So that's the 101. And now I want to introduce our guest. Robert Lopez is an independent journalist based in Los Angeles. He spent more than two decades at the Los Angeles Times. And there he was part of a reporting team that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2011 for public service. an incredible story uncovering corruption in a small city near Los Angeles called Bell. He and several Times colleagues were Pulitzer Prize finalists in 2023 for investigations that dealt with corruption, criminality, and worker exploitation in California's legal cannabis industry. We are really happy to have you here today. In particular, special to us is Robert was awarded a seed grant, a regular grant, and a follow-up grant. So he's a three-peater. Amy Pyle is the executive editor-in-chief of Civil Beat, which is based in Honolulu. Thank you for getting up early this morning, Amy. She has spent two decades running investigative and enterprise reporting teams at USA Today, at Reveal, from the Center for Investigative Reporting, the Sacramento Bee. Most importantly for our discussions today is Amy is on the board of FIJ, and along with the rest of the board, Amy is the person reading your proposals, right? It's the board of FIJ that actually reads and discusses every single proposal. And I will say, from a lot of experience, Amy is among the most insightful reviewers that we have. Um, so Robert,
Thanks, Ellen.
let's welcome to you both. Robert, I want to start with the seed grant. You know, started working on a story about teens and children that were working in agricultural fields and orchards of California. Um, and you were seeing some questions about violation of labor laws and pesticides. You applied for a seed grant in March of 2024. How did that happen? How did you find the seed grant?
Well, I was looking for money. I had done some preliminary reporting, as you stated, and I had uncovered, through interviews with young people who talked about abuses, exploitation, exposures to pesticides, working in the hot sun without shade, other, you know, problems that were violations of state law. And so I needed to expand on that. And to do that, I needed some money to travel because this was really just in one region of California. So I was talking to friends and a good friend of mine, Garrett Theroff at the investigative reporting program at UC Berkeley, said you should apply to the Fund for Investigative Journalism. They have rolling grants. And so, literally in that conversation, I got on my laptop and I went to the FIJ website and I saw that the seed grant deadline was in 3 days. And so I was like, okay, well, thanks, Eric. Or Garrett, I got to go. And so I got off the phone and I started racing to meet the deadline. And fortunately, I did.
Yeah. And what were you kind of hoping that a seed grant would allow you to do?
Well, I needed to do additional reporting to show that there was really a problem as I suspected. Because as I mentioned, I had done interviews in one area, but I needed to branch out geographically in terms of just different regions in California's agricultural farmlands. I needed to go there to broaden the scope a bit. And I also needed to start meeting people who were overseeing pesticide safety, agricultural commissioners, because that was the area that I understood the least. So while I was going to do interviews with young farm workers, I also wanted to start making my introductions at the offices of these county regulators.
Great. Amy, seed grants are different from regular grants, as I, kind of went into a little bit of detail above. You know, we don't expect a lot of reporting, but how much reporting, do we want the applicant to have? Like, what's that sweet spot that you're looking for when you're reviewing a seed grant proposal?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And obviously, it varies a lot because it's early. I think from my perspective, I'm interested in seeing the kinds of questions people are asking, right? It's partly about seeing that they've got the investigative mindset, right? So they don't have to have all the answers, but I want to see that they're asking questions that are going to get them that direction and that they have the start of a methodology that's going to help them answer those questions. So I can see in the case of Robert that he's done some interviews. He has the start of an idea of where he's headed. in his case, he knew that he was, and I know we'll get into some of the specifics. He knew where he was going to go to get some of those answers. So I can see where he's heading with his reporting. And to me, that suggested it was going to be an investigative project, not just one that was a topic. And I could, I could see that it was going to be a good story, or that it had the likelihood of being a good story that was going to be investigative. And that's what I'm looking for in a seed grant. This has the potential. It's not there yet, so it's not a full grant, but I'm intrigued.
Cool. I'm going to pull up a little bit like different excerpts from Robert's Seed Grant because the whole document is too much for everybody's eyes. But I'm going to share my screen again. Uh, okay. So you were saying like the story is investigative in nature. And, Robert, maybe walk us through, because this is directly from your proposal. You've already gotten some stories, right? So, what I like is there's wrongdoing, and you make that clear.
Yes, there is. And I wanted to make that very clear in that first paragraph at the top of your slide, these youth sharing these stories. But the thing is, I knew that this couldn't be uh, a journalism report on, tragic stories. I mean, that's a great news report, but that's not investigative. So the question was, well, who's in charge of protecting these young people? Who are the regulators? So I had to actually look that up and investigate that before I even shared my information in the seed grant application. And so I basically talked about that in the next paragraph in your slide. So the California Labor Commissioner's Office, which oversees the division that is in charge of enforcing child labor and wage and hour laws, wage theft, things like that, failure to pay overtime. There's the Department of Pesticide Regulation and the county agricultural commissioners. Uh, they're responsible for statewide and local pesticide regulation. So those are the agencies that I needed to look at. And the question was, how effective are they in enforcing the laws that are supposed to protect young workers in the fields? And we're talking about child labor laws, wage theft, wage and hour laws. We're talking about workplace safety laws, which was Cal OSHA, which is part of the same sprawling department that houses the Labor Commissioner's Office. And then, of course, pesticide laws. So there were four different entities. And then one of those entities was this sprawling network of 55 agricultural commissioners across California. So that was my focus in terms of the regulatory bodies.
Yeah, yeah. It's you've named a couple of things. First of all, what's interesting to me is it shows you haven't done the reporting yet, right? You're interested in learning, right? And I think that's the thing. We're not looking that you have all the answers yet. Like this really is, I need to figure out who's responsible here. But the accountability angle and the investigative angle, that the potential seems pretty high.
It
Um,
did. And if I can just interject, you're
yeah.
absolutely right. I did not know how good of a job they were doing. I had a suspicion that it might not be good in some areas, based on, just what I knew. But I also, it's important to note, I didn't really even fully understand everything that these agencies did do, especially when it came to pesticide and child labor. Those were just two areas that I had never covered. And so I actually had some learning to do as well in terms of what their responsibilities were as regulators.
Right.
Yeah, I think, Ellen, that part of what impressed me about this seed grant proposal was how open-minded Robert was. He'd heard these stories from kids, right? They were complaining about things. And so he's like, okay, I'm hearing this consistently, but I need to go find out. And these are the people to ask, right? And that open-mindedness said to me, he's going to find out, right? If what they're saying is true, and if so, who's responsible?
Yeah. And uh let's see. So I want to go to the next slide here. Um yeah, and I think also what you included was how this might lead to a fuller investigation, right? Like you're very clear about what you've done, but you even say, I am still in the early stages. of this project, right? Um, I think the other thing is you're pretty clear about how you're going to use the money. And I wonder if you could tell us, like, describe the situation you were in and what this funding enabled you to do.
Well, I had initially proposed this story at the LA Times, and where I had worked for many years, but this was my second stint at the organization. I had come back a little over a year earlier, and I didn't have any seniority as a result. I lost all the previous years of seniority, and I was laid off. So I needed to. I knew this was a good story. I knew it had potential to be a very, very important story. So I was very, intent on getting this done. And so I needed the seed money. Really, it was the lifeline that I needed at that point. I was basically on the cusp of losing the story and losing my communication with some of these young people because I just had to be out there, and I also had to just keep going, get some momentum. And so I was in a very precarious spot, journalistically speaking. So I knew very clearly that I needed to corroborate what I'm hearing through more interviews in other regions. And in my proposal, I told you where I was planning to go, and I'm hoping to interview 15 to 25 of these young people. And as with any investigative, venture as a journalist, you follow one lead, it leads to another area. You follow that, and you just pull on those strings. And so I knew that that's what I had to do, and that's what I meant by developing new leads of inquiry. So this was a very important endeavor for me in terms of doing this application and hoping to get this very essential funding.
Cool. We have a question about framing a federal government initiative that appears to be unethical or wasteful, but is congressionally approved, therefore totally legal. I think we often say, the best investigations are about activity that is legal, not illegal, and it's sort of an abuse and loopholes. But they're asking is there's a particular way FIJ frames government waste investigations, and I would say that it's the same criteria. It's what is your question? What are you hoping to uncover? Um, and how are you going about trying to uncover it? And I'm gonna go to the next slide because this I kind of tried to break down um, the different application requirements, right? So part of what you're not seeing in Robert's application is why is he suited, right? And he explains his experience, in this case, having language, which is really, really important, right? And will make him being able to reach these sources not just a wish, but a greater possibility, right? Again, it's more than a hunch, right? He's got some anecdotes, right, that show a pattern, right? And so there's evidence for us to see that, like, yeah, we can believe that there's a real problem there. We just don't know how big it is, right? Again, he tells us what's different about this from other reporting, right? He's trying to do something that pushes it forward. Um, he acknowledges that there's existing coverage, and I think sometimes people are afraid when we ask them what's already been reported on a story, that somehow you're going to get dinged if the story's been covered. No, we just want to know that you actually know that other reporting's been done and that this will advance it. And then again, he included a budget that was just again very almost back of the envelope calculation. Here's how much I have to drive. Here's how much gas costs, right? Here's a hotel. It doesn't have to be more complicated.
So Ellen knows this about me, but I have actually been known, and I'm not the only voice, so it doesn't mean that the proposals necessarily go down, but I have been known to reject proposals out of hand if people say something hasn't been covered, and I just Google it. I don't even need to go to LexisNexis and find that in fact there's been a story done exactly on that topic, sometimes even in that same city. Um, and it's not because I think that every story has to be unique. It's because if someone says, no, it hasn't been covered, then they don't go to the next field and differentiate their story from the other story. And that's what I want, right? I want you to tell me not so much, oh, my thing is absolutely great and no one's ever covered it, I want you to say mine is this different and deeper and taking a different approach. And if you can't tell me that, if you tell me no, it has never been covered before, it's in fact not true. And I don't, you're not giving me that depth. So it's just really, really an important field that we've added in recent years, and it's important for that reason. So I want people not only to be honest, but to give me that additional depth. So Robert did, and that's part of the reason that this one flew for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so, Amy, I just want to, kind of go through, let me just see. Okay, this is onto Robert's full grant. I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute. Um, but just to talk through, some of the th questions that people get hung up with, right? Because we're about to review what a regular grant proposal looks for. And again, if we were to put them side by side, we'd see that there's a lot of similarities in some ways. Is it investigative? Why are you well suited to do it? Right? We need to know more about initial findings, right? We need to know a letter of commitment from another organization, from an outlet that they're going to publish your story, right? And a more complete, reporting plan. I want to take on this question of is it investigative? Because I think that this is what FIJ funds. We fund investigative reporting. It doesn't mean that a feature story isn't a worthwhile story, an explanatory story isn't a worthwhile story. But when you and I are sitting around reviewing grants and this question comes up, what's your best explanation, right, for someone when they're asking themselves, is my story investigative? Like, what what are we looking for? What are we talking about?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of ways that I look at it. And obviously, we go through this in our newsroom too, because we do explanatory reporting and we do more basic accountability reporting. But we're going to invest in our newsroom or FIJ grants in investigative work. We want to see that there's been actual harm. We want to see that there is a potential to hold someone accountable, whether it's a person or an entity. And we do want to see that there's something unique about it, whether it's something new or something different. And those, are often high bars. And I also ask reporters to really take a look at how it's supposed to work. There's a lot of things that are messed up in the world, right? But if you can't really show that it's broken, everybody's like, oh, there's something wrong here, and it's like, okay, but how is it supposed to work? So sometimes that helps you see that what's wrong. So those are some of the ways that we think about it, but I know you have some additional
Yeah,
thoughts
I
on that
mean,
front.
I heard someone make a really good, I don't know if it's an analogy, but you want to show the contrast, right? The people who hold power, whether they're a government or a business, they may have a goal, right? But this can show, like Robert might say, oh, they have a rule. They actually have a law in place or they have a regulation, right? How far they are failing to meet that goal, right? And then who's being hurt. And so sometimes when you think about those kinds of contrasts, right? Um, Obviously, when power's being abused, and someone has paid the price and someone's gotten away with it, right? So those are just kind of simple ways to frame it. Um, when we again, I think Amy did a good job describing our emotion when we ask, has this story been done before? And people say no, and we Google it and we find that it has been done before. So just understand the audience, right? The people who are reading your proposals, we're journalists, right? Many of us have been editors. The first question we will ask our reporters when they pitch a story is, what's been done on it. So we're asking you the same story. It's where we're always going to start. So again, don't be afraid to say, yes, this story's gotten a lot of coverage here, here, and here. Here's how my story is different. When it comes to the why you believe this is a story, right? Again, what are some basic things that we're looking for? That maybe Robert that you were able to show, right? You when you came back for a regular grant, like you had established what?
Well, I had established that there was indeed some problems with regulation. I had also broadened my network of youths who were interviewed, and they were all corroborating each other in terms of abuse and exploitation out there. But more importantly, I had the opportunity to go to the websites of the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement, which is the division that regulates child labor. And I found that there had been, like, for fiscal year 2021, which was the most recent report available, I think there was 16 child labor investigations in all industries. We're talking about a dozen different industries, okay? So that is not a good number. So I knew that I had to go look at agriculture and get the breakdown by industry uh, for the enforcement operations, inspections, citations, you know, and the actual fines paid down the road. But this was a strong indicator, documentation that this is not good. And then there was Cal OSHA. They enforce workplace safety, but buried in an annual report, it was just a graph, was about 10 years worth of enforcement information on California's outdoor heat law. We were the first nation in the United States to pass an outdoor heat law, which requires above 80 degrees, employers have to give water, provide shade. Um, Inspections and violations had dropped significantly, I think 30%, 40% respectively. So that is a problem. And it all happened while extreme heat was becoming more pronounced across the state. Okay. That's problematic by their own account. So I knew I had to go dig in further and get the breakdown by industry for agriculture, but everything else, because I just wanted to compare. So for me, those were really the two biggest things. I now had some evidence through public records that there was some regulatory problems, but I didn't want to oversell that. So I think I referred to it as uneven regulation. And in the end, it turned out to be failed regulation in many respects and, non-existent regulation, but that was down the road. And I kind of thought that's where it might be headed just based on my experience as a reporter. But, you know, as with any story, you never oversell it to an editor, and you certainly don't want to oversell it to the people who are going to fund you for your grant that you're seeking.
Great. Couple questions. Can we apply for a seed grant in April and then a full grant for that same project in September? Yes. And I would say also, and Robert's a good example of this, if we give you a seed grant, um, you can apply for a regular grant almost as soon as you're ready for it. Like we're gonna look at them. If it's very close to a regular application period, we'll wait, but we'll also fast track it because if you've got the momentum of the reporting and the seed grant is leading to more sources, we don't want you to sit on it. So yes, you can apply for a seed grant, and if you get that seed grant, you can then turn it around and apply for a regular grant. Um, Another question, do we have to have several interviews already for a seed grant? I have some pre-reporting, but not as far as dozens of interviews. Um, the truth is, it's not a dozen. There isn't a specific number. Again, if you have a single source, but you think that source is good, the question is, how are you going to build on that single source, right? Um, how's the seed grant going to take that single source, and say, I think there's a bigger trend here. I think there's something larger going on. So it's not about a number of interviews.
Yeah,
Um,
and I would say Robert's seed grant was more detailed than many. The flip side of that is a number of this, I would say probably at least half of the seed grants we grant are grant proposals that come in as full grants but fall short. And so we say start with a seed grant and then we'll see. So they are more detailed. So, there's a sweet spot somewhere in there. And, you can always try, but I would say, it's maybe short of a dozen interviews, but more than one. So somewhere in there, you need to be, closer to a full proposal probably than just an idea.
Yeah. Another question. I'm a freelance journalist, which means I have no consistent salary. Can we say we want the grant to cover our own salary or pay, or does it have to be for all expenses? You can paying yourself for the time you spend if that's where you need the money. Some people need money for travel because that's the way they're going to be able to validate the story. Some people just need the time to do the research. It's a local story. They don't have to travel. It really depends. But yes, you can, that's a legitimate budget. And then, do you primarily fund current issues or do you fund historical issues? We have funded historical issues. What we're looking for is the relevance and the potential for impact. We certainly know that cold cases, particularly during the civil rights era, can still have impact today. We funded a really excellent project about a murder that took place in a sundown city in Indiana in the 60s. But it was an amazing story that revealed new details that were important today. So I think the question is it investigative, once again, and what's the potential for impact? Do you need to have a news organization locked in for a seed grant? No, that's not required. And then, is there any help on how to get an outlet interested in a story? As a freelancer from a science research background, I find reaching out without contacts incredibly unproductive. Who can help me pitch a story to an outlet? That's a great question. And I don't really have a clear answer for that. Often, what we do with seed grants is we give you a mentor. And I think that if that's a potential question for a mentor about what process you could go through to identify outlets that have interest in your topic and how you reach out to them. I'm going to move on to Robert's regular grant now, right? So you get the seed grant, um, you know, you drive almost 1,200 miles across 5 counties. You interview these 12 kids, right? You meet lots of different people. And I'm going to share my screen again so that we can look at what you did in your regular grant. Okay. Yeah. So again, I really love this, Robert, and I think you told me you had never written a grant proposal before, right? So you took the question of how does this advance what's already been reported, and it's your second paragraph, right? You kind of get it out of the way, and I'd love you to just talk through like how did you organize your regular grant proposal? Like you'd never written a grant proposal before. What did you think to do?
Well, I went to the FIJ website and I found a archived YouTube video with a board member talking to a woman who had received a grant. And so I listened to that, and that gave me some insight. And so my grant was basically structured in three parts. It was the introduction, which was just about 2 or 3 paragraphs. The second part was the abuse and exploitation, I would call it, the findings that I had uncovered. And I wanted to show that I had a breadth of different young people. And by that, I mean regional and also true in terms of the different types of abuses. Some of them were similar, but there were also differences. Wage theft, no shade, pesticide, etc. And then the third part was the regulatory agencies, what I know and what I need to do. And in that, I mentioned the issue of, minimal number of, investigations for the child labor division. I mentioned the drop in enforcement in outdoor heat safety inspections by Cal OSHA. So, I wanted to let the readers of this grant know that I've got some documents, but I need to go further. And I also mentioned that my seed grant allowed me to meet a former high-level official with Cal OSHA who was extremely valuable. I was up there reporting in the Bay Area, Northern California, and this fellow lived there. So I reached out to him and said, let's meet. And I didn't want to interview him. I wanted to know, how did Cal OSHA structure its documents? How does it collect them? What type of reports does it compile? What types of investigations does it do? Tell me about the fines. How does it work? And so that allowed me to have the information so I could make very informed and very specific Public Records Act requests. And then he, in turn, introduced me to a colleague at the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement who was still there, who was an attorney who I didn't want to quote, but this fellow agreed to speak to me and explain their record keeping system, the state laws that were applicable. So these were insiders who helped me structure my documents requests and understand a very important aspect of the investigation. How are records kept? What type of inspections and enforcement do they do? And how can I get it? And what's the best way for me to get this? And so these are people who never were mentioned in the story, but they were instrumental. And it was through the seed grant that I got that. And then I explained that in this full grant. And I did run into Amy at a symposium, and she mentioned we talked about the New York Times story, which was about child labor, but it was really far different from what I was doing. But she suggested, yeah, you need to deal with that, and you need to deal with that pretty quickly. We were talking sort of hypothetically, if I was doing this and it was this big investigation, what would you do? And then Amy introduced me to Eric at the symposium. We also sort of talked just generally, not about my application, but if somebody gets a seed grant, what do you want to know? Do you want to know pretty high what they did with that? How specific do they need to be? I didn't know any of that. And so that was all very helpful.
That's
Oh,
great.
and
And
I
I,
wanted to say one thing about records, if I could,
yep,
because
please.
I think that's a thing that trips people up a lot in proposals when we're reviewing them. And, that is one of the things that makes a project investigative, right? Is that somebody is dealing with documents and data. Um, and there's a tendency for two things to be true. One is overpromising. We look at something and we're like, wow, that sounds great, but they are never going to get these documents and this data in this period of time. And or the amount of money that they're saying they're going to need to get that is way less than it's like we have some experience with this, right? Through reviewing these, through the work that we've done. Or they don't have a plan for getting this. They haven't in the seed grant or in the work they've already done. They haven't gotten any of this yet, and it's going to take them forever to get it. So knowing that through the seed grant and through the work that Robert had done, he already had some of this and he had a plan to get the rest. Really instilled confidence that he was going to be able to get more and have that as an underpinning that was going to make this more than anecdotal. And that was one of the things that, persuaded us that this was going to be more than just some stories. It was going to tell us something that was new and unique and grounded. And I think sometimes people do have some of that and they don't want to tell us because they feel like that's one of their investigative findings. And I just want to tell this group because it's a big group and you'll tell your friends that everything that comes in these proposals is confidential. We're not telling anyone, we're not posting these online, but we need to see at least a snippet of some of what you're finding and know that you have it so that we can say, yeah, we see it. We can fund this. So
I'm really glad you added that. Yeah. Robert, somebody had a question, and I feel like you got the seed grant and literally got in your car and started driving because they wanted to know how long it took from your seed grant application um, I think to a regular grant. And you published a story from your seed grant, as I recall.
Yeah, that was probably 6 weeks, I think. I have to say it was pretty quick. And literally, the grant was funded very quickly, the seed grant. And the next day, I was off. So, yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
just needed to get moving. So, yeah, it was all very quickly. And I ultimately did do one story in August of 2024 that initiated with the seed grant because I was in a public records battle already with the division or the Department of Industrial Relations, which oversees child labor in Cal OSHA. And they
Hmm.
wouldn't give me specific information on breakdowns for the outdoor heat law. So I thought the best way to respond to that was with an investigative story. So I did that.
Great. I want to look again, this question about investigative, right? I think Robert really nailed it. Like you just frame this as an accountability investigation, and it really answers this question, what makes us investigative? And I can't stress enough how important, that is uh, to FIJ because that is sort of our niche, right? Again, people provide funding for all sorts of reporting, but for us, it's about investigative. Um, just going to go to the next one. Um, we asked for initial findings, right? And again, this was based on Robert's earlier reports. And so, I said he drove almost 1,200 miles. He really talks about like, what did he do? Like, who has he interviewed? Like, what have they described? Again, if we take the seed grant, which might be more of a general idea, and you just heard Robert talk about he's developed new sources, right? There was enough preliminary reporting and sort of specific examples that he had uncovered. Amy, you want to add anything else to sort of like what we're looking for in initial findings? Oops, you're on mute.
I think it's a combination of some really tangible things. And as I said, we're not sharing them with anyone outside of our boardroom. But then also still some curiosity. One of the things that's a turnoff is if people say like, and this is an 8-part series, and here's the breakdown of each piece, because sometimes that feels a little too pat. One of the questions someone had is, would we fund something that's already well on its way? And the answer is yes. But we want to still see that there's work to be done, right? So we could be at the end of an investigation, but we want to still see that we're funding something. What I liked with Roberts was it was sort of, if you looked at the grant proposal, it's like, child and teenage laborers who toil in California's multi-billion dollar agricultural and industrial are imperiled. Here's the New York Times does his contrast. I received a seed grant. He reminds us what he's already done. Here's like 3 examples, but here's where I still need to go. So right up top told us like, here's where I've been, here's where I'm going. And that's very helpful to us because, we see right from there what we're funding. And I think that's the most helpful thing to me is to kind of have that perspective and then further down have some specifics of, this is why I still need some money. So
Yeah. Someone has asked about they're publishing an online newspaper for 2 years. FIJ grants are primarily for freelance journalists. Again, they're also for nonprofit newsrooms. Just to be clear, we fund a lot of local, even national nonprofit newsrooms. And on occasion, we also fund for-profit reporting as well. We like when they have a nonprofit partner, but it's not exclusive to nonprofit or to freelancers. We probably favor more towards the freelancer, but not exclusive. Photojournalists, yes, we take if you have a photojournalist, so investigation, absolutely, we would consider those. Just looking, any funding for university affiliated nonprofit media. Um, Trying to think. I think so. I'm trying to think. We fund university investigative based reporting programs. I think we've funded programs at Berkeley, at Columbia. So we do fund university based programs. Let me just go back here. Um, Another thing that I really appreciated, because sometimes people spend a lot of time on data and documents, but we don't really understand like the human element, right? The harm. And sometimes people only have anecdotes, and it's really hard to understand, well, are these just anecdotes, or is this anecdotes that represent something that is recurring? It's not isolated to a couple of people. And I think what's really nice is when we get doesn't you don't have to give us the whole story, but here Robert told us, and I've blacked out the names, but of a couple of the kids that he spoke with, right? And it brings the story to life. Robert, maybe you could just talk a little bit about, was it scary to add this part in because you actually used names? And I know that people sometimes worry about the confidentiality, or how did you think that this would help your proposal?
Well, people were on the record and at that point because this was under a previous administration, presidential administration, when this transpired, and things changed drastically, and so did the story in terms of using of names. But I wanted to show that these are real people, and that they're really describing some terrible things and some tragic things. And once again, as I said earlier, I wanted to show that I had different examples, and I wanted to give different types of examples. And so that was my point. I just really wanted to just hammer home the human nature of this in addition to just the investigative side.
Sure,
And
sure.
this shows the harm. I mean, that's what it gets at.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, often a question is, it's a problem, but bring it to life for us, right? And part of that is also, um, how's an audience going to respond to it, right? I sometimes say stories can be important, but not interesting, and we want them to be interesting as well, if possible. Um, so, the final piece of this is the investigative plan, right? Again, you've got the preliminary reporting, you're past the hunch stage, you've got something. But the question is, like, what's your plan for sort of bringing it home, right? Robert, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you arrived at, like, okay, these are the steps I can take to actually validate that the reporting I've done so far is really solid and there's really something there.
Well, it was a matter of looking at the four different entities that I referenced earlier and then asking for the relevant records. I didn't want to be snowed with a bunch of records, but I needed to see worksite safety inspections are critical. And then enforcement. How many people were cited, how many entities were cited for violations, companies, and how many how many how much in fines did you collect? And I also wanted to broaden my base of people interviewed. I wanted 100 in the end. I got 61 because, as it turned out, that was fine. And I also wanted to let you know that I still needed to do some traveling. This is a statewide story. It's looking at systemic issues. So I really wanted to have the strong reporting, not just with documents, but also the impact and the abuse and the harm. It had to be, you know, there had to be enough voices and enough information on that end to really make it legit in my eyes. And in the end, I ended up traveling nearly 15,500 miles.
Wow. That's amazing. I really appreciate this line to corroborate exploitation accounts that again, you were trying to interrogate the people that you had spoken to make sure that their stories stood up. And often when we're in the midst of an investigation, we get emotionally connected to people and we don't always challenge it. So I really appreciated that you were open about that as well. I'm just going to check in on the questions a little bit just to see where we are. Um, so someone was asking about their freelancer working in a story in a market that one of us works in. And I think the question is, they're concerned about sort of showing their hand. Again, we're all investigator reporters and investigative journalists. We really respect people's confidentiality. We're not your editors. We're not going to ask you who your sources are. We're just going to try to find out how you're going to get to those sources and how you know that they're valid. Um, Another person asked about a seed grant application to conduct more pre-reporting on a story. Can it also include substantive pre-reporting? I would say that you just ask yourself, are you looking for a seed grant or are you looking for a regular grant? It sounds like what you're describing, you want to expand the focus to see what the scope of your story would be. That might be more of a regular grant proposal. So you might want to look at both applications and see if you're ready for a regular grant. Um, okay, Robert, stage three. In the end, I'd love to hear about how many stories you actually published and also how an FIJ follow-up grant is continuing, to help you and ultimately what impact your stories have had.
Well, there were five stories total uh, two separate investigations. Um, all stories were published in the nonprofit Capital in Maine and the Los Angeles Times. Uh, the first story, as I said, looked at the failure to enforce outdoor heat laws based on just some of the reporting I had done with the parents. It didn't compromise the child labor stuff, but I did have enough information to make it investigative and use that basic information from Cal OSHA to show them that, they couldn't stop this from coming out. It was in the summer. We were in the middle of some very bad heat spells. They just didn't want this coming out. And so they were stonewalling me. So we wrote something. Then I continued with the primary mission, which was the child labor investigation, and that was published. Well, after the Cal OSHA story, there was some impact. Cal OSHA announced that it was starting a new unit with lawyers and attorneys to go after the most, you know, worst offenders. And then several state lawmakers introduced some bills to improve oversight of Cal OSHA and, get more inspectors out in the field. So there was some minor impact there. So I wrote that story. Then we moved on to the reporting. I got in a big public records battle for 11 months. Ultimately, had to get an attorney pro bono to threaten to sue the state, and they finally gave me the records. So these two stories basically were published in November of this past November, and so they appeared in Capital Maine and the LA Times. And there was some pretty shocking revelations in terms of the failure of the oversight over 8 years. Just 27 child labor citations in all of California and all of agriculture, even though there's more than 17,000 agricultural employers. And 90% of the money, more than 90% of the fines never collected. Thousands of worksite investigations never investigated. Hundreds of investigations were letter investigations, meaning they just wrote a letter and they never visited. There was the pesticide issue. I mean, hundreds of pesticide offenders, repeat offenders were never fined. Uh, we analyzed in all more than 50,000 records. I used the grant to help hire a data researcher who helped crunch some of the data for me. This resulted in the governor's office and his appointees announcing that three key agencies under his control were going to start sharing data information. They were going to pool their resources and conduct task force operations because they all operate separately and enforce separate laws. But by getting together and sharing information, they could identify potential offenders and get out there to protect child laborers. And that was within 2 weeks of the story. I plan on going back to that down the road to see what happened, but it's not. Harvest season isn't really in full swing yet, so I'm waiting on that. And then in addition, so we did that follow-up story. So that was the fifth story. And then in addition, I received a follow-up grant for another pesticide enforcement story that I'm finalizing, and that should be co-published in Capital in Maine and the LA Times. That's actually turned out to be a whole new investigation. So it is, yes, a follow-up, but it's actually a whole other investigation. And you just follow the leads where they go.
Amazing, Robert. Congratulations. Um, just one last point about Robert's reporting in particular, which is we're not exclusive in that Robert was able to take our grant and package it with other grants. And so just something to keep in mind, like our funding can be helpful. For some people, it can be everything, and for other people, you might need some more money. We encourage you to look for other grants. Somebody asked if we apply for a regular grant and it's better as a C grant, will we change the category? Yes, we will change it. You don't have to reapply. Probably half the seed grants granted this year were ones that came in as regular grants. We love that it's not a yes or no anymore, that we can actually say, hey, there's something here. We just need you to do a little bit more reporting, so we're going to give you a seed grant. I
And I
just
think by the same token, Ellen, probably at least half the seed grants then go on to get a regular grant later down the road. We really like to see that. We feel like we're in partnership with them. So,
Yeah, that is a great question. Um, just last question to both of you. Just offer one piece of advice or encouragement to people thinking about applying for a grant.
I mean, I would just say we really want to give you FIJ's money. So, I have conversations with folks who have gotten grants before. Take a look at the various webinars that Ellen has done with other folks, and talked to other people who have gotten grants in the past because it's really possible. And if you do the work, we'll fund you.
Yeah, I would second that. I learned about the grant process just from looking at a webinar that FIJ did, and the budget that they have. Make sure you look at that. I modeled mine just right after that, and then also they have a really great FAQ section. Go over all of that because there's some really useful information in there. So make sure you read that.
Thank you both so much. Just again, a reminder, April 27th is the date for new applications. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute because I think we have just a couple of more questions. Let me just check it out. Maybe we've answered most of them. Let me just see Q&A. Yep, we have. Um, Again, everyone who registered, you are going to get an email from FIJ sometime in the next week or so with a link to the recording of the webinar. Um, Grant deadline, April 27th. Once again, if you have questions, we're available. You can email us at grants@fij.org or org. Again, as Robert said, there's lots of resources online. We really want to help you. We know it's hard out there, and we really want to continue to support this work. Amy and Robert, thank you so much for your time, Robert, for your awesome work. You are an inspiration to all of us. And I
Thank
hope
you,
an
Ellen.
inspiration in particular to all the
Thank
people
you.
online. We hope to see many, many more grant applications and to approve many more. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again to everyone. Take care.